welcome to another edition of What's Happening. I'm Gail Burke, and I'm here with my co-host, George Binns. Today our guests are Superintendent of Schools, Stephen Hershey, and the Assistant Superintendent of Schools, Suzanne Chirocek. Welcome.
Thank you.
And we're going to be talking about Common Core and park testing today. Common Core and park testing are causing confusion and controversy all over the country for many reasons. Beverly started park testing this year as a pilot program. Would you please, Dr. Hershey, explain briefly what Common Core is, and would you please explain what the park testing is?
From the standpoint of Common Core, they're really frameworks meant to be national frameworks. They're really required from the standpoint of we have the most mobile society we've ever had, and so how do we guarantee that kids who come in from other states, who come in from other parts of the country, are basically coming into our system and being able to blend in from the standpoint of what they know and what they've been following. So Common Core at this point is actually the Massachusetts frameworks, because the Department of Education actually adopted them as the Massachusetts frameworks. We haven't always, but for a long time we've had frameworks in Massachusetts. Common Core is similar to that, so they are a guide. They're not dictating what we teach in every class and what the curriculum actually is, but they're a framework with which we work.
And we've had them for 4 years, is that correct?
We've had them for 4 years.
Okay. That brings up the question, how much flexibility do you have with the frameworks?
More than one would think. That's why they are frameworks. So the example I always use is when I was superintendent in Plymouth, Massachusetts frameworks were coming in from the standpoint of pre-MCAS. So what I found, as you might expect, is that at every grade in the elementary schools we were teaching the Pilgrims. Mm-hmm. However, in the frameworks, that wasn't part of every single grade. Mm-hmm. So it really was looking from an in-depth standpoint, when are the Pilgrims supposed to be taught, and making sure that we're focusing in that area at that time, rather than doing it year after year after year, because it's nice to do. When you go back to pre-frameworks, probably the biggest issue that we all had, and I taught under it, is that we all pretty much taught what we wanted to. We had academic freedom at the time. In fact, it was most in our contracts that we had academic freedom. The problem that was causing, at least internally in Massachusetts, is if I was teaching geometry and I had a child come in from pick a community, Plymouth, they may be coming into my class and not having had the same background in geometry that I expect for my kids, so it was causing problems. So it was really about standardization around making sure that the expectations were similar, that the framework was there, but within the context of how I actually taught the concepts, I had the freedom there, and I have the latitude. It's the same now.
So, if I understand it, then there's a certain minimum standard that everybody has to achieve.
Right.
And you, as a district, can set the standard a little higher, depending upon the teachers, depending upon the town.
Right.
Like you mentioned, Plymouth has got to talk about Pilgrims. There's no way out of that. And, for instance, what are we doing different in Beverly?
As far as?
Better than the standard, better than the framework.
Actually, a tremendous amount of things that we're doing better than the framework.
I read someplace where you only have like a 15% leeway as far as what you can innovate from what the Common Core frameworks are.
Well, a standard is it's a guide. A guide almost.
Right.
It's not a specific recipe for a lesson.
But
it is
the park is driven by what
that's a set of assessments.
Right.
But it kind of in response to what George just asked, one of the things it allows us to do is to take a look at our standards and our alignment of standards. And then within the grade level, differentiate. So teachers will sit around and they'll look at a standard, which is really, maybe 2 or 3 sentences, and they have to ascertain and interpret what does that mean. So they're working on understanding what that standard means, and then they have discussions and conversations. What are the outcomes we expect students to have with that? What do we think that will look like when students can do that before they even begin to design the lessons? I think there's a bit of a misconception that the Common Core is this recipe of everybody teaching the exact same thing every single day in their classrooms. And really, it's really a standard of a measure of expectation of outcome.
I think the most important part, whether it's Common Core now or the old Massachusetts frameworks or whatever frameworks, because I've been in Vermont, the frameworks are very similar. What it has done is forced an engagement of teachers working together to flesh out the instruction in the classroom, and so the conversations are very rich, and because they're very rich and teachers really understand what they're doing, how it plays out in the classroom for kids, actually it excels very well. You know, so some of the things that we do well here is that, you know, our MCAS scores have been fine. Our problem with MCAS is it's very old right now, and so there needed to be something new, something different. Whether PARC is the solution or not, we won't know. But you know, it allowed us to engage in our own assessment because we felt very strongly in the school committee as well that we wanted to be able to speak from knowledge as the forums are being held around the state around whether PARC is the future or whatever. But I
think you hit on something that has confused and angered a lot of parents and teachers, because Beverly has not had any public forums. I know you've spoken to parents and to teachers, but as far as public forums, and we talked about this before, that hasn't been done. So there is still a lot of confusion.
Yep.
About what Common Core is and about what PARC really entails. And I know they have done it in Peabody. So I would ask you again, would you consider holding a public forum to inform
in the last few months? So at each one of the elementary schools I've been sort of going around.
But not for the public, just for the parents.
They were open. They were open for anyone to come and join us.
They're not well advertised, I think, is part of the problem.
Yeah, I
didn't know they were happening. And
no, I didn't. I had heard from a parent that they had parents.
Yeah, some of what's going to happen going forward is going to be forums across the state.
Well, they've already started them.
But they're not going to be generated by the school districts. They're going to be generated by either the Secretary of Education's office, or actually the legislature is also talking about putting together some forums that give the public an opportunity to talk and to move forward around what we're going to be doing either next October or in the future. I think we know and embrace that MCAS is old, needs to go away.
That has not been decided yet, though.
No, but it has been decided from the standpoint that if we choose MCAS as a state, it will be a new MCAS. It will not be the one that we're doing right now.
It would be changed, which is, I don't think anybody has a problem with that.
Yeah, so when I say what I said, it has more to do with, we know it's going to change. And I think that one of the things as we go through PARC testing this year is we've been looking for real specific things. So our hope is that some of the real issues with MCAS go away, and some of the issues had to do with how much time is involved in the testing, had to do with the actual
data, how quickly we get access
how quickly we get the data, because that's always been a problem.
Well, and I know that with Pearson, who is the publisher of the PARC, has had numerous problems in the past with getting the data out, with getting it accurate, and that sort of thing. And I know when you talk about time, I have heard from different cities, parents in different cities, that some of the PARC testing takes 3 days on one shot, and then 3 days at another. It seems like an awful lot of time, especially for the younger kids.
So the third piece, and then let me come back to what your point, is the third piece for us is how it engages kids. So let me start with that one first. So it's interesting that whether it's PARC or it's new MCAS, We know that the electronic portion of it is going to be an important part because these kids are very data literate. And so we've looked at the engagement of kids as they're actually taking the exam, and is it more than it looked like in the old form of MCAS that we were running. So we have concerns. If, in fact, the time is not less, because our concern always is the amount of time for instruction. And so MCAS was always touted as being a learning experience. It was for a while, particularly in the first few years, because it was new and it was something vibrant and it was different. But as it got to be an older test, it became just a task that you're going through. So we're looking for something that's going to engage kids, be time well spent from an instructional standpoint, not just from an assessment standpoint. So I think those are the pieces that we're looking at, and if we don't get the turnover so that we get the data earlier, that's a problem too.
Then what do you do?
I think that what we will be doing is advocating at the forums that this isn't necessarily the solution for Massachusetts over the long haul. Superintendents in particular have been very clear since the beginning of MCAS that we've lost a ton of instructional time to assessment. And we want to we're always trying to recapture instructional time. And so a solution that isn't shorter and gives us data faster needs to then be a solution that the time is well spent on instruction rather than it's just simply a time taking an assessment. So that's always been a challenge. But one of the reasons we wanted to do it this year was to have Beverly's data, to be able to talk at the forums, to be able to speak up around what we see as the problems or the positives, because even if they develop a new MCAS, we don't want it to be lacking shorter time, quicker turnover, and making sure the kids are engaged in what they're doing.
I think one of the things that was really important, and it's such an important point, that if the actual administration of Park this year enabled us to have a much better understanding, both of did Park meet some of the hopes that we had at the beginning, as well as it enlightened us to a couple of things that surprised us. The actual, as much as we said all along, boy, kids are much better on technology than we give them credit for, I think we were even surprised more at how well they adapted to the environment of a computer-based test, and how proficient they were in some of the skills that we didn't think they were going to be as proficient as even though we had hoped that they were digital natives and they were going to be far more proficient. The skills that they have exceeded even our expectations. So that was a pleasant surprise.
Well, one of the things that I think nobody really understands is what's the difference between Park and MCAS? What's supposed to be better about Park?
I think that the structure of the assessment itself.
What does that mean?
So you have MCAS is a test that's largely based on skills. It's a demonstration of individual skills. Park is more of a performance-based test, so it asks you to take those skills and apply them using some higher-order thinking skills. That's the premise. So remember, we haven't finished administering Park. We don't have as much, you're not allowed to kind of go on and read all of the questions and do a lot of things, but just in our general observations, it's asking students to think differently about... Give
me a for instance.
For instance. So for instance, in MCAS, you had probably a lot more computation on a math assessment. You were asked to find the right answer and fill in a bubble, and it didn't really matter how you got that answer. On Park, a math question might have 2 or 3 possible answers, and they're more concerned with how you get to that answer than they are. 3 correct answers. They don't want you to give wrong answers. So, but it might be. You have to explain your thinking more, so there might be different opportunities. Or you would look at a problem and they would ask you, is it correct or incorrect, and how did you get to that determination, as opposed to just simply, here's a multiplication problem and perform your operation.
I guess that's what I have a problem understanding, and I think a lot of parents do as well.
Yeah.
Because if you have a multiplication problem and you know your multiplication tables, there's the question, here's the answer.
Right.
What difference does it make how you got to it? To me, it's like, particularly for young children,
Right.
it doesn't matter.
So the multiplication itself, you're right, but when you come across a real world problem and you want to apply it to something that's either in the science or a multidisciplinary area, knowing which operation to choose, knowing how to apply the skill of multiplication to come up with the right answer to a question.
Again, give me for instance.
Oh boy.
Well, I mean, this is
Well, we're trying to get down to the basics.
yeah, because people are
So for example,
getting very, very
I'm going to
upset
try to
about
come up with
the
an
different-
easy one. So you might have a real world problem that's posed to you on a park-like test, and I can only use examples because we don't actually have the questions from the real test. But determine the perimeter of an area. So you might have been given an MCAS. Find the perimeter of this rectangle. On park, it might say, Mr. Binns would like to build a garden in his yard. His yard is this large. He wants to plant 4 rows of, 5 different types of plants. Does he have enough area in the yard to do that? So you would have to have it's a different approach. You have to know how to find perimeter. You have to know how to find area, but you're not just calculating the perimeter of a single,
So the challenge is for all parents is that their expertise around schools are the schools that they attended and the assessment that they took. The depth of understanding that kids need to have in order to generalize to an answer is much more substantial than it was when we were growing up. It's not that we didn't adjust to it, and if people can think about how they've continued to be able to be employable, they've actually picked that up on their own over time. Our kids don't have the time to pick it up because they're going to be going into a world that going to require that they can take a lot of information, a lot of data, and be able to come up with a solution that makes sense that in some cases may never have been come up with before. So it's getting kids to understand the skills enough so that the technology can help them apply the skills so that their real focus is on the solution to a problem. So to a certain extent, as we talk about time, we're really focusing in Beverly on STEM. We're really focusing STEM. We're really focusing on project-based assessments. So we really want to take the next step. So it's important to us as we do this that the state assessment doesn't cause us to not be able to get to the things that we know work for kids. But if you look at a project-based environment, you're talking about that. So the kids are given a task, given a problem, and then they need to use their skills that they've learned over time to solve that problem. And the answer is the solution. And the other part that we have to do with kids is it's also a collaboration because that's the world that they're in. They're not going to be doing this by themselves. They're going to be doing it with a group of individuals who may or may not be in the same room, who may or may not be in the same country. So they need to learn how to do that. So as a math teacher, for me, what technology has created is that excitement around depth of understanding. So my favorite thing to teach in life was solid geometry. I love to teach solid geometry.
Let's step back just a minute, because I think that we could get into this and go far afield.
Okay.
But I think, for instance, for very young children, and I'm finding from parents saying they're not getting the basics, and that Common Core and Park go way far afield to the point where the children are getting very, very stressed out. The parents are getting stressed out because they're unable to help them with the homework. They don't understand it either. Now, you mentioned that the Department of Education is going around to different cities with these forums. And we have a clip from a recent forum that was held in Fitchburg, which I'd like to run. It's just about a minute and a half. So, and this is from questions from a teacher. Can you run that clip, Matt?
Hi, my name is Caitlin McCarthy. For the past 11 years, I've taught English at Worcester Technical High School, nationally recognized as a Blue Ribbon school. I'm here to tell you that PARC, spelled backwards, is crap. And the word crap accurately describes PARC, the Common Core test developed by Pearson, a global for-profit company. Massachusetts Education Commissioner Mitchell Chester is chairman of the board for PARC Incorporated, which is a clear conflict of interest. Last year, Commissioner Chester said on Fox News that PARC is a test worth teaching to. It's bad enough that Massachusetts adopted and agreed to the Common Core sight unseen, all so it could get its hands on Race to the Top federal funding. Now Commissioner Chester is suggesting that we violate the U.S. Constitution by teaching to the Common Core test, which is PARC. It's against the Constitution for the federal government to dictate curriculum. Teaching to PARC will dictate curriculum. Massachusetts has been #1 in education for years, all because it locally developed its own standards and created its own assessment, MCAS. Throwing out MCAS for PARC will be a tragic mistake, but people like PARC chairman of the board, Mitchell Chester, won't pay for it. The students will, as teachers are forced to follow his directive and teach to the PARC test. Massachusetts is better than this. We need to say no to crap and say no to PARC.
The reference to crap was that PARC spelled backwards spells crap.
Yeah.
That's
No,
what
I
she was
actually heard it
referring
then.
to. Oh, you did? Okay,
Yeah.
okay. But this is the kind of thing that is going on. And when you hear it from teachers and you hear it from parents, and you wonder what these kids are into. Now, I know that we like to say that we're #1 with the MCAS, we had #1 and all of that, and we've discussed this before. Okay, Massachusetts is #1. Alabama is not #1. They're way, way down. Alabama, Mississippi, they're way down here. So if we're way up here, Alabama's here, and we're going to have Common Core standards, this is what happens. Massachusetts lowers their standards so that Mississippi and the other states can raise their standards. That's what bothers me.
So the participation from the Department of Education at the very beginning of this, because you're talking about stuff that superintendents were voicing, that we very much did not want our standards lowered. So originally when Massachusetts got involved, got involved for 2 reasons. One was to make sure that anything that came out of this process did not lower our standards. The second part of which...
Well, before you get off that point, did that really happen?
When we look at our standards right now, are they stronger than they were before? Maybe. They're definitely not weaker than they were before.
Okay.
But we're only into this for 4 years.
Well, this
and
is
the PARC testing is being driven by the Common Core.
Right.
So that if the PARC testing doesn't pan out and we have to change it or lower it, we could very well have to lower the standards.
So you started the show off early, talking about how much confusion there is out there, and I believe there is a lot of confusion out there. One of the things that, at least in Beverly, and I can only speak to Beverly because that's where I'm doing my work, is that the PARC assessments don't drive what we teach. We have created a plethora of district assessments they're teacher-created assessments of our own. We look at the standards and we backwards design our lesson planning. So we take a look at what are the expectations and outcomes for 3rd graders, and the 3rd grade teachers then go back and we look individually at each unit, and before we teach a unit, we design our own assessment of what we think that should look like at the end. And that's what we design our instruction for,
that mean
not for the PARC test.
Does that mean that
I think that's an important point.
You're not using the standard test that comes with the teacher's manual?
That's correct.
So basically, you're inventing your own testing.
Correct. We're creating an assessment.
What you think the assessment requires, or what you think the framework requires. So you can make a reasonably good assessment that says we're still working to the same standards or better.
Correct.
Absolutely.
And we're saying this is so this standard is now in 3rd grade. Students will write response to writing, stating their opinion, and there's certain standards at each grade level, so they should have a certain amount of evidence from the text that they read.
But how does that affect the PARC testing? Because it's going to be compared
Well,
with PARC
we
tests
believe
from all over the state.
if the PARC testing measures proficiency of what's been defined in the standards, then we're going to teach what's in the standards, and they should do well on PARC. We're not pulling PARC apart and saying we have to teach this so they'll do well on PARC.
Well, basically what you're
We're
telling
saying
me is you don't know what's in PARC. They won't tell you what the question.
we talked earlier today. I said
So
to Dr.
basically-
Hershey, I said, you know, one
So
of the
you're guessing what the PARC testing is going to be.
Yeah.
And you're guessing.
You're not supposed to know what's in PARC. It's supposed to be a measure
Why?
in time, because it's supposed to be a measure of students' proficiency so they can benchmark across how
Yeah,
students
you don't
are
want anybody
performing.
gaming the test, obviously.
I mean, any
Correct.
national test that has ever been given, going all the way back to when we were doing the achievement tests before, you didn't see what the tests were covering specifically. You really needed to do your job. So from our perspective, the work that's going on right now, we're confident that what we're doing will take care of PARC. But it's not PARC that's causing us to do it. We believe what we're doing and
Is good
building and the
instruction.
work
Yeah.
of teachers is really good instruction, and we have confidence that because we're doing it, it will take care of the testing for us.
But you may be surprised that there's a disconnect between your
and-
interpretation
Well,
of the framework and what the PARC is testing
One of
for.
the things that always I kind of find curious about the big debate about PARC or MCAS is I don't really care what they want us to give. We're just going to teach what we're supposed to teach in grades 3 and 4 and 5. And when
do
the
it well.
assessment comes, if we've done a good job and if we've been, you know, working together and collaborating and creating curriculum maps that match the instruction that we believe is what's supposed to happen, then we will do well on whatever assessment they give us.
But you have to
believe
work
that.
within the frameworks of Common Core, right?
Well, where we work within the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks,
Right,
and the
okay.
Massachusetts curriculum frameworks incorporate the Common Core. That's where
Right.
that 15% number comes from.
So that you
Massachusetts
can't-
had the ability to increase or provide more rigor, or, for example, they added standards in preschool that aren't part of the Common Core. So the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks run from pre-K to 12, and they incorporate the Common Core so that we're meeting the requirements of that. But they're designed. I think it's very important that they're not weaker than the former set of frameworks, and I believe they're more rigorous than the former set of frameworks.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you again if you would consider for Beverly to have your own Beverly forum so that the community can come together and not be angry and not be confused. And we haven't even talked about opting out of PARC, and parents are doing this all over the country. So I think we really need to have some informational
Yeah, and I think-
evenings.
Second, really,
Go ahead.
would you two be willing to come back and continue this thing? Because we're just
have-
getting wound up
Yeah,
right now.
we have a lot of
We're just
questions.
warming up.
Sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
All right. Okay, let's do that.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming.
welcome.
This half hour, as usual,
It went by
fly
very
by.
quickly.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a lot of information
Sure.
and a lot of
Sure.
questions to ask. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching, and we will see you next time.